Just making sure I'm recording the webinar for folks. Going to return to screen share right now. Thanks for being here all. It's so good to see you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us from. I'm really excited and pleased to welcome you to our parallel event, SRHR and Climate Justice, Advancing a Human Rights-Based Approach. And I am going to pass it off shortly to the moderator and the person who will welcome you more fully to this event. But first and importantly, I want to give a brief note about interpretation. And to access Spanish and French interpretation of this webinar, please find the bottom section of your Zoom control bar a small globe feature that will say interpretation. Click on it and choose the language that you would like to listen to the webinar in. On your computer, you will see it as this top photo shows on the bottom bar. And if you are joining us by your phone, you will likely see it under the More function, also on the bottom of your phone. So I will pass to our interpreters to make sure that message is shared in Spanish and French as well.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Il y a de l'interprétation disponible pour cette réunion en français et en espagnol. Pour y accéder, comme vous voyez sur l'écran, il faut cliquer sur le symbole en forme de globe. Vous choisissez français et vous cliquez sur terminer. Si vous utilisez un téléphone, cliquez sur les 3 petits points. Buenos días a todas y todos. Hay interpretación disponible para esta reunión. Si quiere escuchar al español, haga clic en el símbolo de globo abajo de su pantalla, elige español y cortar el sonido original. Si utiliza un teléfono móvil, utiliza los 3 puntitos y elige español y también silenciar el audio original.
All right, thank you so much. And in addition to these notes on interpretation, I also want folks to know that I am serving as the accessibility coordinator for this call. So if there is anything that arises that we can do to make this call more accessible to you, please email Mara Dolan, and I'm putting my email in the chat. It is mara@wedo.org, and I will do what I can. All right. I'm going to go ahead and stop screen sharing and pass over to you, Heather.
Great, thank you, Mara, and welcome everyone. It's a huge pleasure to have so many of you with us today, and we're really looking forward to an inspiring session. So we're gathered here at an important moment for recognizing the intersections between gender equality and the climate crisis, as this is the first time it's the subject of the Commission of the Status of Women. So my name is Heather McMullen, and I'm your moderator today. I'm a lecturer in global public health at Queen Mary University of London, and I've been working on the intersections between sexual and reproductive rights and health and climate change for some years. And I'm really excited to see all of you and to be here and to hear from our exciting panel we have prepared for you today. So climate change, gender equality, and sexual and reproductive health and rights are inextricably linked. At the most fundamental level, we need control over our bodies to respond and adapt to the climate crisis. And there is no climate justice without bodily autonomy. We know that climate change negatively impacts sexual and reproductive health and rights. And we see this in data and evidence related to poor maternal and neonatal health outcomes due to heat and air pollution, in increases in gender-based violence during extreme weather events and times of stress and scarcity. We know that climate change exacerbates the drivers of child marriage and causes instability to health systems that deliver essential sexual and reproductive rights and health services. We also know that all the negative impacts of humanitarian crises from extreme weather events bring with them, a number of impacts on gender equality and SRHR. And we also know that climate change, and what we see more and more, is the ways that climate change is an amplifier of existing vulnerabilities while creating new vulnerabilities, and that people who are experiencing intersecting forms of discrimination and oppression are hit harder. So this adds to the acuteness of the intersection between SRHR and climate, as sexual and reproductive rights and health are already a set of rights and health topics that are marginalized, even at the best of times. So to reiterate, bodily autonomy and integrity are fundamental to responding to this challenge. And we know that sexual and reproductive rights and health and gender equality are transformational when realized and upheld, and are very much a cornerstone of resilience. They're essential in and of themselves, but in times of a changing climate and of compiling crises, we know that these rights and health areas take on a renewed urgency. So SRHR must be considered a core component of climate adaptation and resilience, and of climate justice. And women and diverse people are taking the lead in responding to these challenges all over the world. And we're lucky enough to hear today from an excellent panel on some of this positive and inspiring action at a really important time for our movement. So in today's session, we will explore and share key recommendations for global policy spaces like CSW. But first, I would like to introduce the hosts of our event today. So this event is being brought to us by the Sexual and Reproductive Rights and Health and Climate Justice Coalition and the Women and Gender Constituency of the UNFCCC. So the SRHR and Climate Justice Coalition is a global network of more than 25 civil society organizations committed to collective action and coordinated advocacy to advance sexual and reproductive health and rights and gender equality in the context of climate change. And this is from an intersectional and climate justice approach. The coalition emerged from the need to create a space where we can break down silos between SRHR and climate justice organizations and movements to facilitate knowledge sharing, jointly mobilize and amplify the voices and priorities of grassroots organizations led by women, youth, girls, the LGBTQIA+ community, and Indigenous people from the Global South, particularly those in the most affected people and areas. Members of this coalition include representatives of women's rights, feminists, sexual and reproductive health and rights, and climate justice organizations, movements, advocacy groups, research, and academic institutions. So welcome everyone from the coalition who's here today. And in July 2021, the SRHR and Climate Justice Coalition submitted a joint commitment at the Generation Equality Forum, a global gathering for gender equality convened by UN Women and co-hosted by the governments of Mexico and France. And the coalition is committed to advocate to advance the GEF Action Coalition commitments on bodily autonomy and SRHR and feminist action for climate justice for an initial period of 2 years, with the possibility of extending to 5 years. So this forum brought together government, civil society, youth-led groups, UN agencies, and the private sector to ensure commitments for gender equality. We are also hosted by the Women and Gender Constituency. So the Women and Gender Constituency is one of the 9 stakeholders groups of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, also known as the UNFCCC. Established in 2009, the Women and Gender Constituency now it consists of 33 women's and environmental civil society organizations who are working to ensure that women's voices and rights are embedded in all processes and results of climate policy. So as the Women and Gender Constituency represents the voices of hundreds and thousands of people across the globe, members of the constituency are present at each UNFCCC meeting and intersessional to work alongside the Secretariat, governments, civil society observers, and other stakeholders to ensure that women's rights and gender justice are core elements of the UN Convention on Climate Change. So that's a little bit about our hosts today. And today we're going to be hearing from panelists and experts from both the SRHR and climate justice space, and also from the coalition, which, as we mentioned, was launched last year at the Generation Equality Forum. So we're going to start today with a panel discussion, followed by a very short film. Then we will introduce the coalition's CSW specific fact sheet, and then we will have a chance to hear from you with your questions. So if you have questions, please place them in the question and answer box at the bottom of your Zoom panel. So I will now move to introduce our exciting panel. And I'd first like to introduce Biplabi Shrestha from ARROW. Biplabi is a program director at the Asia and Pacific Resource and Research Center for Women. And ARROW is a global South feminist organization based in Malaysia that works towards an equal, just, and equitable world that enables women and young people to realize their full sexual and reproductive rights and health. BIPU's long involvement in gender equality and women's health are inspired and informed by the lived realities of women and girls in Asia. And as a program manager at ARROW, BIPU has managed ARROW's multi-country program that builds constituencies and new alliances to develop knowledge and ownership of gender, feminism, and SRHR. So welcome, BIPU. And the question that I have for you today is, how are you seeing these challenges, some of which I've kind of mentioned in the introduction, being addressed, and what kind of solutions are being advanced in relation to the specific challenges between climate change and SRHR in your region?
Thank you, Heather, for the introduction. So what I'll do is I'll share a presentation to answer the question, but I'll start with a bit of an overview of the context of climate change in the region. I don't know if is the screen shared? Can you see the screen, my screen?
Yeah, we can see the screen, but if you go to slideshow and present, right. Yep, there we are.
Great. So basically, as Heather was saying, that we already have to establish an understanding that climate change is not gender neutral phenomenon, and it disproportionately impacts women, girls in all their diversity, and gender non-binary individuals because of the pre-existing gender inequalities that are perpetuated by social practices, structures, and institutions. So the Asia-Pacific region is at the forefront of experiencing the impact of climate change and its related disasters. Many countries in the region are located at the top of the most vulnerable countries in the world. And this was something that was highlighted in the IPCC report that just came out. The climate change has resulted in more frequent and extreme weather events. Countries like Indonesia, Philippines, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan are especially vulnerable to these extreme events. And according to the 2022 IPCC report, these global hotspots of high human vulnerability are also found particularly in this region, for example, like South Asia, as well as the small island developing states, which are also in the region. And there's this report from ESCAP Asia Pacific that the Asia Pacific region has its annual loss of 675 billion due to climate-induced disasters. So here, so in many contexts, the challenge is really, really systemic and also structural, which means that women, girls, and non-binary people in all their diversity, in all their intersecting diversities, are at the higher risk of experiencing the harmful effects of the climate crisis. And people who experience multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination, such as on the account of their ethnicity, caste, race, disability, or migrant status, for them, the vulnerability is even more heightened in this context. And many of these adverse impacts relate to their SRHR, as they lead to lack of access to sexual and reproductive health and rights services. Universal access to SRHR becomes even more challenging in the context of SRHR, because SRHR is least prioritized in many countries and in the context even before the onset of disaster.
Ripu, do you mind just slowing down a little bit for our interpreters?
Yeah, sure. So I will now share some examples from the region that are actually found in our studies, and these are also highlighted in the SRHR and climate change brief that was prepared for WGC at the last COP. These are some examples. So the efforts of climate change are also an indirect driver of early forced and child marriage, as Heather said in the introduction. This is also recognized as a harmful practice. And when extreme weather events destroy livelihoods, the financial distress of local communities and families can lead them to consider marrying girl children as a coping strategy. And these are highlighted by our partners in Bangladesh and Nepal, who have found in their studies that families are practicing child marriage among their young daughters as a means to escape poverty brought about by climate crisis. And another study on sexual and gender-based violence during disaster situations in Indonesia, Laos, and the Philippines revealed that child marriage and domestic violence occur more frequently in the immediate aftermath of the disasters. And child and early marriage increases the risk of early pregnancy, which makes the girls more susceptible to issues such as the obstruction at the time of delivery and leading even to maternal mortality, as well as placenta tears. So there's also this access to comprehensive sexuality education that becomes non-existent in the context of climate crisis, with the rise in girls dropping out of school and any other information education platform. This is again highlighted in our studies in Nepal when climate extreme events happen. Oftentimes, it's the young girls who are among the first ones to be affected to the extent that they are forced to drop out of school. And the increasing workload in the households and economic hardship experienced by the family would also cause parents to withdraw their daughters from schools so that they could either help out at the home or in the farm or to find a job to supplement the household's income. And this in turn, again, limits their access to information, including comprehensive sexuality education, that further also hinders their empowerment. So when there's this vital infrastructures, such as clinics and highways, which are disintegrated by extreme weather events, especially with floods and landslides, the access to sexual and reproductive health services can be obstructed, leading to negative sexual and sexual reproductive health outcomes. For girls and women who are displaced and living in humanitarian settings caused by climate change, lack of access to SRHR services is the leading cause of death. And also disasters hit girls and women harder over the immediate and long term, as they are often poorer than men and yet have larger burdens of care. So in Laos, our studies have shown that our low utilization of reproductive health services are further exacerbated during climate disasters, especially in rural areas, contributing to higher maternal and neonatal and infant mortality rates. Our studies in Maldives have also highlighted that healthcare services are not available in all the islands. And for women living in the outlying islands where SRHR services are not available, they have to travel to another island that offers these services and has gynecologists. However, during harsh weather conditions, sea level is unsafe and sometimes impossible. And this often also results in pregnant women with either pregnancy or delivery complications being unable to access timely health services. There are actually a few more examples. So in Pakistan, women in Sindh province had more difficulty in seeking sexual and reproductive health services compared to men during displacement due to two reasons. One is the unavailability of women doctors in the camp or shelters, and second is women are not allowed to leave the temporary shelter on their own to access health services. And these are attributed to cultural practices and strict male dominance in the province. And in the Philippines also, it was the fisher communities among the marginalized population who are more vulnerable to SRHR violation due to the lack of services. And due to the frequent marginalization, sexual and gender minorities are also often more severely affected by disasters and extreme weather events. So this is, I just quoted this from the Guttmacher report, that SRHR is linked with climate change because the health of a future population will affect a country's ability to cope and adapt. And there is this very dominating but damaging population control narrative as well, because it is attributed to reducing population growth. It is understood that reducing population growth reduces greenhouse emission, which is a false narrative, and it is also violating a lot of SRHR of women and girls. So these are also some of the other things that our studies have shown, that that women and other marginalized groups are not at the negotiating table when it comes to decision making regarding climate change related solutions, and hence their issues are made invisible. So our recent studies have also shown that the policy landscape on gender, climate change, and disaster risk reduction is diverse, and they are quite focused on the top-down approach of driving gender responsive action. And in national policy frameworks, key gender-specific issues such as sexual and reproductive health, disability, and gender-based violence also get skipped very easily from planning processes and often have to be also traded off with competing priorities. Our studies in Cambodia has found that technical documents and strategies for gender mainstreaming at policy level are inadequate, and the ones that exist do not have sufficient practical information. And this is very relatable to other countries as well in the region.
Sorry, Bibu, do you mind just a bit slower? We've just got our interpreters here trying to interpret as you speak. Thank you.
Sure. How much time do I have left? I think I'm running.
I think about 1 minute.
Okay, I'm just on my last slide after this. So in Vietnam, the policy processes are also not backed by evidence-based advocacy and in-depth research about gender. And gender analysis is often missing from strategies. Stakeholder engagement is also limited to some experts who may not know details of ground level realities. And again, like, you know, the representation of women and non-binary people are really, it's really poor at the policy making. So I want to leave with these recommendations as we are also discussing this at the CSW, right? So what do we need from our states, and what do we need from especially, like, you know, what do we need at the end of this, the states to agree on is that meaningful participation of women, girls, and gender non-binary people in all climate-related discourses and decisions. It's really important. They also need to address the structural and systemic factors, including repealing and abolishing discriminatory practices and policies that exacerbate gender inequality and violate sexual and reproductive health and rights. There should be an assessment of gender and climate change policy framework to enable CSO's engagement at all levels. And this also requires our governments to fulfill their commitment that they have already made, like we have Beijing, we have ICPD, we also have SDGs, and we also have GEF framework now. They also need to ensure that national policies, programming, and budget related to climate change and disaster risk reduction incorporate gender mainstreaming and SRHR and include gender differentiated impact analysis of climate change disasters and gender equality. So as CSOs, it's really important for us to keep our advocacy efforts concerted and our network strengthened in order to highlight the synergies of the intersecting issues of climate crisis and SRHR, and to demand climate justice. And we have to really bridge the silos that we see in our efforts also. So we need to keep pushing for SRHR and also keep the SRHR from the margins to the center of the climate discourses. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a really great presentation for giving us some really concrete examples from your region, really seeing the ways that SRHR, gender equality, and climate change are coming together. But also thank you for drawing attention to some of the structural and systemic vulnerabilities, and also pointing at some of the false solutions that are sometimes proposed at this intersection. And do, if you have questions for Bipu, please do put them into the question and answer section. I'd now like to move to our next panelist, which is Claudia Szymas. And Claudia is a medical student from Poland, serving as a liaison officer for sexual and reproductive health and rights issues, including HIV and AIDS, and is with the International Federation for Medical Students Associations. And this group represents over 1.3 million medical students from 130 countries. Claudia has worked in the field of SRHR for 6 years with special interests in gender equality, gender and sexuality diversity, and sexual health, and explored intersections such as the climate change effects on SRHR, access to services for left behind populations, and health literacy in the context of sexual and reproductive health. On the national level, she's worked on advocating for access to safe abortion, family planning, comprehensive sexuality education, HIV and AIDS prevention, and also eliminating discrimination on LGBTQIA+ community through policy papers, grassroots campaigns, and workforce education. So a huge welcome to Claudia today. Thank you for coming to share your expertise with us. And I guess the question that I have for you is, can you tell us a bit about how the concept of care is part of your work and the work of youth organizers generally? And what does it sort of look like in the context of trying to advance action and action on sexual and reproductive health and rights in the context of climate change?
Thank you, Heather. And I'm very happy and honored to participate in an event with such diverse and passionate experts. So before I introduce the concept of care in the work of IFMSA, I would like to build a base for intersection of climate and health, because climate change is also a health crisis. So we could see that not only through observing the direct effects of climate-induced disasters, but also through assessing health consequences of, for example, air pollution and rising temperatures, or on cardiovascular and pulmonary systems. We also know that climate affects SRHRs, and that goes beyond direct effects on health, but also results from systemic barriers such as shrinking access to services in the times of crisis. We could observe that in the pandemic, we could observe that in humanitarian settings, and we will observe that in climate emergencies. So these barriers, such as limited mobility, reduced availability, or affordability of services, will only increase. And this also takes into account the projected shortage of 18 million healthcare workers by 2030. So as healthcare services might become less accessible, this will hit SRHR services the hardest. And now, before I move forward, I would like everyone present here to close your eyes and think what you do when you can go to a healthcare professional and in the time when you feel sick. So I will just give a moment to imagine this scenario. So most likely you just imagine yourself drinking tea, taking some painkillers and other medications. So this also outlines what we wanted to convey in the message, which is self-care. So in the work of IFMSA, we want to emphasize the importance of health literacy, and that is also the perfect example of when we are sick, we know what to take. We know that we need to take some painkillers. We need to stay home and just take care of ourselves. And health literacy goes beyond that, because we need to understand our own health, how to cater it and how to maintain it, and when to seek professional help. So that also includes other services, other sicknesses, and so on. So practicing self-care is extremely crucial in the adaptation of health systems to climate change, and it is especially important in ensuring access to sexual and reproductive health and rights services to left behind populations. But when we hear self-care, once again, the image that comes to our minds is usually like resting, exercising, drinking water. But the concept is much broader. It includes taking medication, taking tests, screening, maintaining hygiene, using applications and websites to keep track on our health and practices. And those are just a few examples of self-care interventions. And in case of SRHR, it is, for example, taking contraceptives, menstrual management, self-managed abortion, pregnancy self-monitoring, or testing on sexually transmitted infections. And this is also important because social and cultural factors often restrict access to SRHR services, and this puts a higher burden on of climate-related deaths to women, people with disabilities, LGBTQI individuals, among other left-behind populations. So implementation of self-care interventions in the context of SRHR would overcome the barriers posed by climate crisis, but also through social stigma or systemic issues, such as low availability of services, and so on. So this also includes having services that are more confidential, more affordable, but also more accessible, because we practice them mostly from our homes. So it does not include traveling to healthcare settings. Self-care also empowers individuals to have control over their bodies and help them to make informed decisions regarding their health and well-being. And we as IFMSA affirm that self-care does not shift the responsibility to an individual. So it's not only a person that practices self-care that is responsible for their own health, but it also requires systemic support that ensures a health and digital literacy, creates enabling environments, and also allows reaching for professional help. So when it in times when health services are unable to respond to population needs, and this might be the case for climate crisis, caring for oneself with clear understanding of our health, with available information, would reduce inequalities in this regard. And this is why, as youth-led organization, we promote digital tools in SRHR services, conduct comprehensive sexuality education activities in our national member organizations that increase people's knowledge on SRHR, and conduct awareness campaigns on SRHR issues. We conduct multiple campaigns on, for example, cancer prevention, like breast cancer, testicular cancer. We increase knowledge on contraceptive among populations outside of school settings as well. So just to emphasize that youth is the power that creates the social change, and we use our power to create healthier societies despite the lurking climate crisis. And we are also particularly vulnerable as youth-friendly services. So once again, youth-friendly services are the ones that maintain confidentiality, are non-judgmental, and respond to health needs of young people. They are yet to be universally implemented, but we also are particularly vulnerable because climate affects our own future. And this adds another reason for our generation to practice self-care in times of climate change, but we also can use technology in our own advance. So that was just a quick overview of how practicing self-care could help us to overcome health inequities, but also help us maintain health in the context of climate change, especially for SRHR services, especially for vulnerable populations. So thank you for your attention, and yeah.
Thank you so much, Claudia. Thank you for reminding us about the power and innovation of young people, and also really pulling out the sort of impacts and relationship between climate change and health, and also the way that it impacts health systems, and also for engaging our imaginations a little bit with that activity. So thanks, it was really great to hear from you. I'd now like to introduce another young person, Zainab Yunusa. So welcome, Zainab. Zainab is a delegate of the UNFCCC's youth constituency, Yongo, and of the Women and Gender Constituency. And she advocates for inclusiveness in global climate change decision-making and action. And she is currently serving as the Youth Movement and Campaigns Coordinator at Plan International, and is also a member of the UNFPA SRHR and Climate Joint Working Group. So welcome, Zainab, lovely to have you here. And the question that I have for you is, how are youth and young people organizing to shape national climate plans and policies to include a strong SRHR focus?
Thank you very much, Heather. Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to amplify the voices of youth and their efforts globally and even locally and at their community level, especially girls and young women. And so youth are they're organizing individually and also as a collective, both at international level and also global level. And most of the time at international level, at individual level rather, and community level, you find young people advocating for the integration of SRHR by amplifying their lived experiences and that of their peers, because this is something that they've experienced. This is something that has happened to them and is affecting them because of climate change. And so, for instance, even the UN mentioned that those that are termed climate refugees, those that are displaced as a result of climate-induced impact or effect, are mostly women. And even bringing it down to Nigeria, where I'm from, in the northeastern part of Nigeria, where there is what we can term a climate crisis, about 53% of those that are internally displaced are actually women, comprising of also young girls. And so this was part of the reason why I recall when Nigeria was trying to submit a revised version of NDCs, there were a group of young Nigerians, including myself, we thought that how can we influence this national plan? And for those that are not very familiar with climate change terms, NDCs are nationally determined contributions. It's actually like a national action plan document that shows how a country is committed to mitigating against climate change or adapting to it. And so we felt one way to put this issue that is most of the time underrated, that is not prioritized, is by also creating maybe a list of recommendations to sort of impute that the final version of the revised NDCs. And so that was why we came together and organized a youth consultation. This youth consultation was actually virtual. It had about 280 young Nigerians from across Nigeria. And we also had the presence of Honorable Minister of Environment, Sharon Ikiazo. And the good thing about that is that even when we saw the final version of the NDCs, it wasn't exactly encouraging because we didn't explicitly get that, get the word sexual reproductive health and rights noted in there. But the good thing is that from there, we launched a youth engagement mechanisms. And so there are youth working groups of different thematic areas, of which one of the thematic areas is called cross-cutting themes. And that is where the recommendation for SRHR actually falls under. And after going to COP26, one of the things that we thought we could do to continue the momentum is to be organizing post-COP sessions, where we're now bringing together young activists that are passionate about education, about girls' rights, about sexual reproductive health and rights, and also climate change. So we're bringing them together in these post sessions, sort of dialogues and webinars to create this platform for exchange of information and knowledge and ideas so that they're able to see and understand the interlinkages between climate change impact and each of these themes that they're passionate about. And so that way it is easier to organize as a collective to then push for further national policies, both at national level, state level, and even international level. And so even beyond that, we have the another network that I belong to is the UNFPA Joint Youth Working Group, like Heather already mentioned. And so it's just a group of, and this is more at regional level per se. It's a group of young people that are interested in climate change, advocating for it, and also.
Sorry. Do you mind slowing down just a little? Thank you
Right,
so much. I know it's all very exciting stuff.
All right then. And so what we're doing is sort of co-designing interventions for climate change and sexual reproductive health to try and make a base and a reason, like to say, these are issues that are interlinked. These are issues that need to be taken as climate adaptation strategies. And so part of the big deal, like the big achievement for us, was that in the recently concluded COP, we organized a number of side events with UNFPA. And from the feedback that we received, because one of the aims is to try and make sure that sexual reproductive health is a major issue. It should be a word, it should be a theme, it should be an area that when you ask people, what have you learned from COP? What did you get to understand or gain more knowledge on? We want to hear sexual reproductive health and rights. And this, to an extent, was a success in addition to the efforts of constituencies like Yongo, like the Women and Gender Constituency, and other sexual reproductive health agencies that were there. So we believe that that is a very good stepping stone to create this awareness, to create more interest, like what we're doing now, people talking about these issues, the interlinkages. So that is that. And also there is Yongo, which is the UNFCCC Youth Constituency. So Yongo also had young people came together to create a working group called the Women and Gender Working Group. That's a sub-working group under Yongo now. And so we created that because we felt it was very important to specifically advocate for inclusion of, gender sensitive and transformative climate policies. And part of what we've done so far is that we have the opportunity to always draft policy inputs, like what are those languages, what are those recommendations that we want in policies. We're able to come together as a group, draft those, submit it, and to an extent, we even influence those that we know are going to be part of our party delegations from our countries at climate change negotiations. So we influence some of the recommendations that we want them to go into those tables to negotiate for. And those are part of the things till date that we have achieved as youth organizing. And we want to even take it a step further in the coming COP27 in Egypt. So we want a situation where some of us are actually those people negotiating for some of these issues. So when we have somebody like me, for instance, now my capacity built and I'm there negotiating on climate change issues, definitely as an advocate for sexual reproductive health and rights, this is an issue that I will hammer on. This is an issue that I will push for. This is something that I would say, it's important. We want this to be recognized and as a human-centered adaptation approach, and we want necessary funding, resources for research, for what have you, healthcare and infrastructure to be done, to be put into place. We want commitments and we want it back to resources. And then the last one I will hammer on is, which is very recent, is that when the CSW was going to, before the start, there was a CSW Youth Forum that was actually co-created, co-designed by young people. Now, young people from all over the world, national gender youth advocates. We had youth leaders from the action coalitions on feminist action and even climate justice. So we all came together. First, there were consultations, community level consultations that were held, about 25 of them in North America, Latin America, Caribbean, Europe, Asia, everywhere that you have. And then we had held this 2-day forum, and we came up with a list of recommendations, which we tagged the CSW66 Global Youth Recommendation, Youth, Gender and Climate. And one of the key input of that was point 9, to be specific. It was on sexual reproductive health and rights and sanitation. And what were we asking for? We want universal access to quality and affordable sexual reproductive health. We want laws and policies that will promote social protection. And we also want free and equitable access for contraception. So this has been submitted to the chairs of the CSW, and we are hoping that, one thing we always say, we want youth voice. This is now, we have come together to organize, to put this recommendation, we prioritize our issues. Sexual reproductive health is one of it. It is very linked to the theme of CSW for this year. So this is a great opportunity for this recommendation to be put together. So whether it is virtual consultation, whether it's workshops, whether it's webinars, policy recommendation, input, social media advocacy, youth are not relenting. We are pushing, we are organizing for what we want. We want SRHR to be focused in policies, whether at national level or international level, because it affects us, especially the girls and young women there. And so it's just a glimpse of what we're doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zainab, for that really exciting kind of glimpse at what you're doing. It's really good to hear about the ways that young people are organizing, influencing policy at the national level, but also at the global level, and really becoming part of global climate policy systems. So thank you so much for that. Just a reminder to our speakers to slow down. We've got a live interpretation going on, so we want to make sure we catch all of the amazing insights and information that you're sharing with us. So I'd now like to introduce our next speaker, which is Patrick Kanemo. And Patrick is the Director of Advocacy and PhD programs at Pathfinder Tanzania. And he's been in this role since April 2020. So Patrick is currently responsible for a portfolio of 4 projects, 2 advocacy projects, one on advancing abortion rights and post-abortion care, and another on the prevention of sexual violence against children. And the other 2 projects are PhD projects. Prior to joining Pathfinder, Patrick was the Director of Programs at Sakika, a local NGO working on governance programs in the health sector for 7 years. So welcome, Patrick. It's wonderful to have you here. We can see your slides, but they're not quite in slideshow view. So maybe if you click on slideshow, you can, there we are, perfect. Thanks, Patrick.
Thank you very much, Heather. Hello, everyone. Yes, so as my colleagues have shared, we know that climate change is not a gender neutral issue. We know that, for instance, when we have droughts, this compromises hygiene for girls and women, as we know that the little water available is normally used for drinking, cooking, and in general, they have a negative effect on women's time and management of the household. We know that women and girls have to walk long distances in search of water when water sources are declining. But we know also when there is scarcity of water, rainwater particularly, food shortages are also inevitable. so you find again, it is the women and children, pregnant women particularly, who suffer the most. So climate justice programming is therefore a key to sustainable climate adaptation efforts. And in this particular context, SRHR becomes a tool for climate adaptation. So I put a diagram up there just to sort of visualize how the connection between SRH and climate change, and specifically here, Pathfinder, we advocate, we like to see a world whereby everyone is able to access contraception or SRH services. So family planning is core to our programming, and it's a tool which can be used for adaptation. Access to voluntary family planning services allows families to be able to choose the timing and spacing of pregnancies as well as family sizes. And we've seen this leading to better outcomes in terms of maternal child health, but also educational outcomes, and also improved income at the household level. And these essentially leads to improved resilience and adaptive capacities of families, leading to that decreased vulnerability or reduced risk in general. So providing voluntary family planning increases family individual capacity to adapt to the effects of climate change. So at Pathfinder, the way we do our programming, we do women's-led climate resilience programming through an integrated PHE approach, so population health and environment. And so in this particular approach, the key issues which we are trying to address in a community, and this is mainly sort of rural communities living in biodiversity hotspots, so near conservation areas. We try and resolve or work on issues to do with natural resource degradation, so food insecurity, population pressures, climate change, limited economic opportunities. And so the PHE programming now addresses this in an integrated manner, where we address, we try and improve access to quality health services, SRH services, but also at the same time try to address issues of ecosystems, so improved freshwater ecosystem management and strengthened terrestrial resource management. We use strategies such as ensuring that we have extensive dialogue on gender, environment, and reproductive health with the communities, but also we promote policy advocacy with communities and the government to ensure sustainability. But also we try as much as possible to have evidence data that informs the programming. So we would conduct baselines, and over time would also monitor the improvements, which then we share actively with the communities, with the government, to ensure that we get that buy-in. And we have seen this leading to outcomes, good outcomes. So we're having communities which are empowered, resilient, and economically secure. So, for instance, in one of our programs, which we're implementing jointly with Nature Conservancy, which is a conservation organization, we have seen these outcomes over 10 years. So an example here, we have been able to reach 150 people with reproductive health services, but we have been able to convince households to adopt positive PHE behaviors, around 11,000 households in the particular landscape. So the landscape has about 240,000 households. So, sorry, 49,000 households. And we have been able to reach around 11,000 households. And in some of these villages, we've been able to convert whole villages to be model villages, where most or majority of the households are able to adopt positive PHE behaviors. And examples of positive PHE behaviors is, for instance, use of latrines, having clean model houses, but also use of treated drinking water, use of mosquito nets, utilization of family planning services, but also when you talk about terrestrial and livestock areas, we're talking about climate smart agriculture, so climate smart practices. But we also have integrated activities such as improved civic participation, use of energy saving stoves, and so on and so forth. So yes, we would highly then recommend, as a program, recommend the use of that integrated approach. But in addition to that, in our programming currently, we are also thinking of introducing social accountability. Social accountability normally aids and has been shown to improve community voices. So it's a mechanism which shortens what they call the accountability chain, where instead of in addition to communities holding policymakers to account via elections, then the policymakers holding service providers to account, we introduce a mechanism whereby the communities are able to engage directly with service providers, giving them power to hold these service providers to account. And specifically here, we would be recommending a use of a tool such as the community scorecard. And the community scorecard usually has a number of steps, but the specific key steps is sort of initial kind of planning with the communities, and then separately bringing the communities and the community and the service providers to somehow assess the specific service parameters, be it availability, promptness, and then kind of look at what are the barriers and facilitators, rank them, and then later bring them jointly to discuss these particular issues, see what are the particular barriers, and agree on what are potential solutions to improve service availability in general. So this is a tool which we would want to institute in our landscape, and hopefully in that way then we'll be able to improve access to SRH services, but also improve community involvement in general in availability of services. This is just a model which shows what the community scorecard can actually achieve in terms of impacts. We should expect to see improved health behaviors, increased utilization of services, see institutional changes, which would lead then to maternal and neonatal mortality rates to drop. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Patrick. It's really good to hear not only this view from your context, but also some of the ways we can move in relation to this intersection. So I think we've come to a place very much where we acknowledge some of the intersections between SRHR and climate, and people are now asking what some of the programmatic responses might be, or some of the ways that we can take action. So it was great to see some of the examples included in your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'd now like to introduce Rafia Rauf from the Forum for Safe Motherhood and the White Ribbon Alliance. And Rafia is an experienced professional with a demonstrated history of working in Pakistan's development sector. She's currently working as a national coordinator with the Forum for Safe Motherhood, which serves as the Pakistan chapter of the White Ribbon Alliance. Her career spans over 18 years, during which she's worked in areas of project design, implementation, grants management, organizational evaluation, and change management. So we're very lucky to have her with us today. And Rafia, can you tell us a bit about your work advancing the health and reproductive rights of pregnant people and mothers, and how you see climate in relationship with all of this?
Thank you, Heather. You know, the problem with being the last panelist is that everybody just wants you to finish quickly. So I will try to make it short. Okay. So as you mentioned, my name is Rafia, and I'm working as a national coordinator at the Forum for Safe Motherhood, which serves as the Pakistan chapter of White Ribbon Alliance. We have been working in Pakistan for the last 2 decades, and like all other members of the White Ribbon Alliance, we have been focusing our efforts on advancing maternal and newborn health and nutrition, as well as gender equality and women's and girls' empowerment in the country. Now, to answer the question posed by you, I think I would like to start from the beginning. Back in 2018-19, a global level campaign was carried out by White Ribbon Alliance. Called the What Women Want campaign, it reached out to 1.2 million women in 114 countries across the world. In Pakistan alone, we reached out to 250,000 women. Now, under this campaign, we asked all these women only one question, and that was, what is your key ask regarding your reproductive health? Now, the answers that we got were quite varied and interesting. Some were very predictable, like women asking for better qualified doctors, well-equipped facilities, latest equipment, things like that. Whereas some were actually quite unexpected and also somewhat strange for us in the beginning. Let me give you some examples. Environmental pollution came out as a major problem, with responses like, we should save our babies from polluted environment, or due to bad environment, I had to send my children away. Or we send our children to school neat and clean, but because of dirt and pollution, they come back with dirty uniforms. I'm sure all the mothers out there can really identify with this one. And finally, we should provide our children good schools and good environment. It's interesting that good education is coming at par with good environment. Then, need for plantation was voiced by many. For instance, I want my village to be full of trees, or that there is lack of trees, oxygen is short, and it is hard to breathe. Another one, need forestation for climate change. And then there were the repeated concerns for heat and how it is dangerous for health. Responses like babies must be protected from heat and sun. Children must be kept protected from harsh heat in the summers. A mother has to protect her child from heat stroke. So honestly, all these responses were an eye-opener for us. Many of these women, they were not very well educated, they belonged to rural areas, and yet they recognized how important environment or climate at large can be for their health, in particular, maternal and newborn health. Now, we know that research has demonstrated that there is a clear link between increased temperature and diseases in pregnancy, like hypertensive disorders, eclampsia, as well as diseases associated with the fetus, like stillbirth, low birth weight, prematurity, congenital heart diseases. Now, we know all this. And here we had women who, without all this research data, were worried. And very rightly so, since they were the ones who were actually directly experiencing the impact of climate change on their health and in that of their children. So motivated by the desire to change things, to whatever extent we can, we decided to take a deeper dive into this phenomenon and, gather some data. Since high temperature and heat waves had been brought forward as an area of concern, so as a first step, we reached out to some women in those areas which were known to experience extreme heat. So these were District Jacobabad in the province of Sindh and District Bhavalpur in the province of Punjab. Now, let me just give you a perspective of how hot things can be there. In District Jacobabad, the average temperature during summers is 111 degrees Fahrenheit, and it regularly surpasses 122 degrees Fahrenheit. It is considered as one of the hottest cities on earth. In Bhavalpur, which is in Punjab, the average temperature during summers is 105 degrees Fahrenheit, but the district has been witnessing temperatures up 120 degrees Fahrenheit in the last 4 years. Just to give you a context, the maximum body temperature a human being can survive at is 108 degrees Fahrenheit. So imagine 108, 111 in Jacobabad regularly, and 120 in Bhavalpur. So just imagine. Now, in these two areas, we spoke to women who were pregnant and also those who had just had a baby. And what we heard from them was really heartbreaking. Women talked about their children developing rash and stomach problems due to the heat, and then having to take care of them and do the housework all while doing pregnant. And added to that are the long power outages caused due to the overall excessive stress on electricity system. They spoke about not having the resources to install solar panels and waking up literally all night to fan their newborn babies, through a handheld fan. Now, armed with this information, we are now moving forward. As a first step, we have taken their voices to the Global Climate Summit, that is COP26, last year, where in the WHO Health Pavilion, the nexus between climate change and reproductive health was deliberated upon for the first time. Imagine that. Today, we are bringing these voices to you. Following my talk, we will be playing a short video for you. This video will give you an insight into the reality of climate change for pregnant women and obviously their newborn babies. You see, if maternal and newborn health are a priority for us, then it is this realization that needs to be brought forward to the forefront and especially shared with the decision makers, with the policy makers at the national level, at the regional level, and obviously at the global level. So I think after this, after my talk, we'll be playing the video, and we hope that you will enjoy watching it and you will find it as moving as we did. Just to let you know, this is the first step, but not the last step, obviously. We are now also aiming at doing some research to explore this phenomena further. And we are actually, as a first step, aiming at two main things. Number one, Pakistan's national climate change policy, which came forward in 2012, and which, while talks about health and climate change effects on health, it does not talk about reproductive health. That is our first aim. In addition, there is work underway on a draft policy, on a policy for climate change on effects on health. We have seen the draft document. Once again, there's no mention of reproductive health in that. So we are aiming at these two documents right now, and keeping that in mind, we'll be doing some research work, and we are hoping that it will play an important role in getting reproductive health included in these policies. So this is for the next steps, but for now, we'll be playing the video for you. It will be capturing the voices of pregnant women and women who have just had a baby from district Jacobabad and Bhavalpur. So I hope you enjoy watching it.
Thank you, Rafia. It was really good to hear about some of the ways that this is manifesting where you are, some of the action that's being taken, and now to see this that Maura is just queuing up.
जब मेरा बच्चा पैदा हुआ ना, गर्मियों में बहुत ज़्यादा गर्मी थी, सर में थोड़े थोड़े से दाने निकले। ये बच्चा जब पैदा होता है ना, वो 3-4 दफ़ा पेशाब करता है, इसने एक दफ़ा किया था। फिर मैंने डॉक्टरों को पूछा, उसने कहा गर्मी की वजह से ऐसा है, इसको ठंडे जगह पर रखो जहाँ पर पंखा नहीं थी, लाइट नहीं थी, बहुत तकलीफ थी।
Pakistan faces devastating human health impacts due to climate change, including increased exposure to extreme heat. Sindh and southern Punjab provinces regularly experience some of the highest temperatures in the world. Summer temperatures are often dangerous for human health, even deadly. It is expected that in the near future, the region will experience increasingly higher temperatures.
गर्मी ज़्यादा है, लोड शेडिंग है, इससे गर्मियों में तो मैं तो प्रेग्नेंट भी थी, मेरे साथ तो और ज़्यादा तकलीफ थी। मेरे बच्चे जो पहले 2 बच्चे हैं वो बीमार हो गए थे इन गर्मियों में बहुत, और मैं खुद प्रेग्नेंट थी, मेरे साथ हालत थी, ना मैं अपने बच्चों को टाइम दे पा रही थी, उनको संभाल पा रही थी, ना मैं उसको।
Pregnancy is often a forgotten risk factor. For both biological and socio-economic reasons, it creates additional vulnerabilities to extreme heat and other climate impacts. Exposure to high temperatures is linked with stillbirth and with higher rates of premature birth and low birth weight. These can mean higher infant mortality rates and lifelong health consequences for children. Pakistan has some of the highest rates of premature birth in the world.
ये ज़्यादा गर्मी है, मुझे बहुत मेरी सांस फूलती है, और उसके अलावा बार-बार सुस्ती होती है, कोई घर का काम नहीं कर पाती हूँ।
Increased exposure to extreme heat during pregnancy also increases inequities. Women living in poverty have less electricity and access to cooling. As water sources dry up, some women must travel further in the heat to get water, including while pregnant.
गर्मी ये है कि हमें बस लाइट की मजबूरी है, पंखा हो ना फिर थोड़ी सी कम होती है, जब बच्चा सोती है हम अपना काम वगैरह करें।
जी देहात में सारा दिन एक तो लाइट नहीं होती, दूसरा बिल भी बहुत ज़्यादा आते हैं, और ना लाइट भी भेजें और बिल में भी कमी करें ताकि हम पंखे भी चला सकें और अमीर लोग तो सोलर प्लेटें लगाकर पंखे पे बैठे हैं, हम गरीब क्या करें ताकि वह सोलर प्लेटों की कीमत कम करें, हम भी लगवा सकें और बिलों की कीमत भी कम करें और ताकि हम पंखे भी चला सकें.
New mothers often follow the Chila tradition, in which women are supposed to keep their bodies warm for 40 days after delivery without taking any showers or baths.
मेरा दिल करता है मैं बार बार नहाऊं, ठंडा पानी पीऊं, लेकिन हमारे यहाँ बड़े बुजुर्ग नहीं पीने देते, लेकिन गर्मी बर्दाश्त नहीं होती मुझसे, लेकिन ये करना पड़ता है. पानी भी कम पीते हैं, लाइट नहीं होती, गर्मी बर्दाश्त नहीं होती.
Thank you for that excellent video that really highlights the voices of people experiencing this intersection and also gives us a bit of context, because one of the areas where we're seeing increasing data coming out is on the intersection between maternal and neonatal health and climate change and heat and air pollution. So thank you for that insight. We're now going to thank you actually to all of our amazing panelists. And I really want to take this moment to encourage people to put your questions into the Q&A section because we're going to be able to hear more from our excellent guests and respond to some of your questions. So please do give us your questions now. And in the meantime, we're going to focus a little bit more towards the task at hand around CSW. And we're going to be hearing from Eleanor Blomstrom. And she's going to be presenting the fact sheet that was prepared specifically for this important meeting. So Eleanor is the Senior Manager of Policy and Advocacy at Women Deliver, where she leads the work on SRHR and climate change, and as well as on universal health coverage. She's worked with diverse constituencies and in movement building around sustainable development, health, and gender equality, and across spaces, including the Commission on the Status of Women and the High Level Political Forum, and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So welcome, Eleanor, and looking forward to hearing more about this fact sheet.
Thank you so much, Heather. It's definitely a pleasure to be here today as part of the event from the SRHR and Climate Justice Coalition, especially representing Women Deliver as one of the co-convening organizations along with IPAS and We Do. And just as Heather stated at the outset of the event, the coalition really aims to break down silos between sexual and reproductive health and rights in climate justice organizations and movements, and facilitate knowledge sharing, jointly mobilize and amplify the voices and priorities of grassroots organizations. I think we've done quite a bit of that today through the presentations from our amazing speakers. And one aspect of our work that is really important is to create among us collective policy recommendations that can influence key climate and sexual and reproductive health and rights advocacy spaces and international conferences. So for CSW 66, we have developed a fact sheet that is intended to support advocates, policymakers, and negotiators to really understand and then act on this intersection of SRHR and climate change. So the fact sheet itself provides first some background about how climate change is underpinned by root causes that are grave injustices, that gender equality is hindered by climate change, and it launches also into a number of key messages around how these linkages can be thought through, not necessarily in sequence, but just different way to think about them. And then on the backside of the fact sheet, it outlines 6 key recommendations that are meant to support bold strides in the CSW this year in the outcome document, really linking gender and climate change and ensuring that we are addressing gender equality and SRHR from this intersectional lens. So I believe that we've actually heard almost all of these key messages that you can find in the fact sheet through the voices of our speakers today. And I wanted to highlight just 3, and then I will share the recommendations for those who want to see how we are trying to influence the outcome document. So first, SRHR and bodily autonomy are foundations for achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls. And the realization of SRHR is crucial for climate justice, for strengthening resilience, and for supporting adaptive capacity of marginalized people and communities who are already experiencing the disproportionate impacts of climate change, including loss and damage. And then fundamentally for the coalition is that a human rights-based approach to climate action includes ensuring universal access to the full range of SRHR. And in the documents on the second side, it does go into what do we see as the full range of sexual and reproductive health and rights. And we had drawn on the Guttmacher-Lancet Commission, and it talking about the essential package of SRH interventions as including gender-based violence, HIV/AIDS and other STIs, contraception, maternal and newborn health, abortion, infertility, and reproductive cancers. Then, as I'd said, importantly, there are a number of specific recommendations, and I don't want to read them all in full, but I think it's important to see that given everything that we heard from our speakers about how climate change impacts SRHR and the important space of CSW this year, where it's for the first time bringing the concepts of climate change, disaster risk reduction, and environmental issues into the CSW, that we wanted to help guide the policymakers and negotiators. So the first recommendation is that at CSW, we can't rely only on agreed language that is often pulled out in the CSW spaces. So it's really a time to look at the reality on the ground and bring in new language that can help to impact access to SRHR and fulfillment of rights. The second recommendation is about mainstreaming gender. In order to make progress, that governments should commit to mainstream gender and SRHR in national policies, programming, and budgets. And importantly, to engage girls and women in the design, development, implementation, and monitoring of rights-based policies and programs. The third recommendation is around finance, and we know there's a real lack of finance and resources supporting women's and feminist organizations for climate work, and particularly at the intersection with SRHR. So we are asking governments to commit to robust and feminist financing that is also additional. A fourth area that has been mentioned is the need for data, for information and education. So we need further investments in the collection, analysis, and use of disaggregated data. And we also need this continued education and information, a commitment to that, including comprehensive sexuality education. All of that can support women and girls' participation and leadership in the just and equitable transition that we're looking for. We have a fifth recommendation that looks at the Gender Action Plan under the UNFCCC and encourages governments to integrate SRHR into all 6 of those priority areas. And then finally, collaboration, to have governments look at how do we bring collaboration between government entities, but then also in different spaces, whether it's the CSW, the COPs, or the Generation Equality Forum follow-up. So we're hoping to see a really strong outcome this year at the CSW, and just to remember also that CSW is not an isolated policy space. So these recommendations are built on what the coalition did at the COP in Glasgow in 2021, and we'll take these through a number of different conferences and policy spaces this year, but always fundamentally drawing on the lived experience of women and girls and gender diverse people, and keeping at the base a human rights framework and ensuring that the rights to sexual and reproductive health are always accessible to everyone. Thank you. Wait, you might want to know where to find this document. And so the coalition has a webpage on the Women and Gender Constituency website, and I think we'll put in the chat the link to that. And you can find this fact sheet in English, Spanish, and French.
Great. Thank you so much, Eleanor, for sharing this important and useful resource with us. We're now going to go to some question and answer. Many of you have asked for the slides, so if that's, we're going to request that from our panelists, and if that's appropriate, we're going to share the slides with you when we share the recordings and translations. So watch this space in terms of receiving those resources. And I think what I'll do is I'll summarize a couple of the questions we've received, and then I'll ask the panelists to respond in keeping their comments quite brief, because we don't have much time left. It's flown by with all this exciting information and presentations. So I think some of what people are asking is how you see your work in this area, and I guess specifically on the intersection of sexual and reproductive rights and health, being affected by the global anti-gender movement backlash. We also have a question about sort of formulating national climate policy. So people are asking when you're formulating, for example, national adaptation plans, how can we create more pressure and advocate, and how can we work in coalition to better influence the development of climate policy documents to reflect SRHR, and that's coming specifically from the context of Bangladesh. And then we also have a couple questions that are asking about how what we've learned, so what kind of best practices we're seeing from programming, and especially for including women and vulnerable groups in the process of decision-making and action planning at different levels, and also how we can increase collaboration with different actors specifically on this intersection. So if our panelists could respond to aspects of those questions, I would be grateful, and also maybe include a reflection or two on what you're really hoping to see out of CSW. So I'll now turn it over to the panelists for some brief comments.
Heather, I can go first.
Great.
So on the question on how to recommend to include SRHR on the plan, National Adaptation Plan, my recommendation is to really use the evidences. And there are a lot of evidences and there are a lot of studies that have done that looks at the intersections. And I'm also actually happy to share some of the studies that ARO has done. So we can use that to create that pressure. The other thing that also can be done is to pulling in the international agreements or instruments that the governments have signed on to, which actually says that they will holding them accountable on the international instrument that they have signed on to. So that's another way of also going about it, and also looking at other allies within the country, because there are organizations who are looking at these intersections. So maybe forming a coalition, a country coalition, or or working with the organizations who are allies. That would also be another way. That would also be an additional way to go about it. Yeah. And I leave the rest for the others to respond.
Thank you, Ripu. Thoughts from other panelists?
Hello, Patrick. Yeah, I'll try and turn on the video. Yeah, there we are. So yeah, there's a question with regards to challenges, lessons learned in terms of involving women, vulnerable groups, specifically in these social accountability mechanisms. We're trying to give voices. Yes, there's general challenges in terms of voices. So you understand it could be quite intimidating sometimes, especially to young vulnerable women, where they're brought into these spaces. Specifically, if you talk about the community scorecard, you have the focus group discussions. So really, it's really hinged on the issue of facilitation. So initially, as an NGO or CSO may be moderating these, you initially would want to start with general education or orientation to the communities in terms of how to engage in these spaces, and the fact that each voice counts, and that there isn't any unintended consequences that would happen. So trying to empower these participants in these groups. And then obviously during the exercise itself, obviously looking at the dynamics and ensuring that you're giving spaces and voices to the most vulnerable, ensure that they are heard in the different platforms. Yeah, that's how I would put it. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Any other comments from our panelists?
Maybe I can add something to the one on the backlash. So that might be a little bit optimistic, but I just wanted to emphasize that we are still progressing each day. We're closer to gender equality and ensuring SRHR services, even though the progress is slow and not as fast as we could. We just need to remember that that it's still going forward. But yes, there is an increased backlash, anti-gender movement, and so on. But what is important for us is to never stop advocating and just to keep forward with our activities. And just the more backlash we have, the more power we should get and act on that. So I hope that the anger and the frustration that we have in this time, we can just tailor it and create a more meaningful movements and so on. So that will be just like a quick optimistic remark from my side.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Claudia. And if there's no more comments from our panelists, I'd really like to take this opportunity to thank everyone for their insights. Hopefully this is just the start of many conversations you're going to be having over the next couple of weeks and onwards, but specifically because of CSW taking place right now. So thank you so much to our incredible guests and panelists for sharing these insights, for really highlighting some of the important, exciting, and positive work taking place in this space. We really want to thank our interpreters, our NGO colleagues, the whole Sexual and Reproductive Rights and Health and Climate Justice Coalition, and the Women and Gender Constituency for putting together this event. And the coalition, if you'd like to join the coalition, Eleanor has shared the link. So please do consider that. You'll be able to access the recording shortly after, and we'll also link to some of the resources, the important resources that have been shared today. And we really want you to take a look and make use of those in the best way that you can at CSW, but also beyond. And we've had a really wonderful opportunity today to hear about some of the excellent work taking place at this crucial intersection, and really illustrating how women, girls, and diverse people are really agents of change, really taking the lead at all different levels, at policy, global policy level, national policy level, community level, in the framing and advocacy and healthcare settings and onwards. So thank you again to our guests for really bringing us those inspiring examples that can hopefully fill us with energy and enthusiasm for some of the negotiations. In closing, we really have a great opportunity here at CSW to advance action for women, girls, and marginalized people who are currently living the unequal impacts of the climate crisis. We can't achieve climate justice without gender equality, without sexual and reproductive rights and health, without a human rights approach. And we know that bodily autonomy is fundamental in responding to the climate crisis. So I'd really like to thank you again, and also wish you a very good CSW, and hope that you're leaving us today feeling inspired and activated by some of what we've been able to share, and that we'll see you soon in other collaborative and organizing spaces. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ella. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye-bye.